The February wind cut through my jacket like a blade as I made my way to the barn for the evening chores. Snow had been falling steadily for 3 days, blanketing our Montana farm in a pristine white that made everything look peaceful and still. I'd lived on this land my entire life, inherited it from my grandfather, and thought I knew every inch of it by heart. That's when I heard it, a faint whimpering coming from behind the old red barn. At first, I thought it might be the wind playing tricks on me, but as I rounded the corner, I saw something that made my heart skip. There, half buried in a snowdrift, was what appeared to be a small dog, barely moving. I rushed forward, my boots crunching through the deep snow. The poor creature was tiny. Couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, with dark fur matted with ice and snow. Its eyes were barely open, and it was shivering so violently I was amazed it was still alive. "Hey there, little guy," I whispered, carefully scooping him up in my gloved hands. He was so cold, so fragile, that I was afraid he might not make it. His breathing was shallow, and I could feel his tiny heart beating rapidly against my palm. I tucked him inside my jacket and hurried toward the house, my mind racing. Where had he come from? There weren't any neighbors for miles, and I hadn't seen any stray dogs in the area. The nearest town was 40 minutes away on a good day, and with this weather, it might as well have been on another planet. As I climbed the porch steps, I had no idea that this moment would change everything I thought I knew about the wilderness surrounding our farm. Inside the warmth of my kitchen, I could finally get a proper look at what I'd found. The little creature was even smaller than I'd initially thought, probably no bigger than my fist. His fur was a mix of dark gray and black, with small patches of white on his chest and paws. What struck me most were his eyes, a piercing blue that seemed almost too bright for such a young animal. I wrapped him in an old towel and set up a makeshift bed near the wood stove. The poor thing was still shivering, so I filled a hot water bottle and placed it beside him. He curled up against it immediately, finally seeming to relax for the first time since I'd found him. My first instinct was to call the local vet, but Dr. Henderson lived in town, and with the roads the way they were, there was no chance of getting there tonight. I'd have to make do with what I had on hand. I warmed some milk and tried to get him to drink from a small syringe I kept in the first aid kit. At first he resisted, but hunger eventually won out, and he began to take small sips. His tiny tongue was rough against my finger, and I noticed his teeth were already quite sharp for such a young animal. Throughout the night, I checked on him every hour. Each time, he seemed a little stronger, a little more alert. By morning, he was actually trying to stand on his wobbly legs, though he couldn't manage it for more than a few seconds. I decided to call him Scout, after the way he seemed to be constantly observing everything around him with those intense blue eyes. Little did I know how appropriate that name would prove to be. Over the next week, Scout's recovery was nothing short of remarkable. What had been a half-frozen, barely breathing creature was now a playful, energetic puppy who seemed to grow larger by the day. His appetite was enormous. He could easily eat twice as much as any dog his size should have been able to handle. I'd set up a proper bed for him in the mudroom, complete with blankets and toys I'd picked up on my next trip to town. But Scout seemed to prefer following me around the house, his little paws clicking on the hardwood floors as he tried to keep up with my longer strides. The strangest thing was how quiet he was. Most puppies are constantly yapping and whining, but Scout rarely made a sound. When he did vocalize, it was more of a soft woof or a low rumble that seemed oddly mature for such a young animal. Dr. Henderson finally made it out to the farm once the roads cleared. He examined Scout thoroughly, checking his teeth, his reflexes, and listening to his heart and lungs. "Healthy as can be," he declared, though I noticed a slight frown cross his face as he looked at Scout's teeth. "Mixed breed, I'd say. Probably has some German Shepherd in him, maybe some Husky. That would explain the blue eyes and the thick coat." After the vet left, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seemed puzzled by something, though he hadn't said anything specific. Scout had been perfectly behaved during the examination. sitting still and allowing himself to be handled without any fuss. That night, as I watched Scout sleep by the fire, I noticed how his ears twitched at every small sound outside. Sounds I couldn't even hear. As Scout grew, I began to notice behaviors that seemed unusual for a domestic dog. He had an uncanny ability to appear and disappear silently, often startling me when I'd turn around to find him sitting right behind me, watching with those penetrating blue eyes. His hunting instincts were incredibly strong. He'd spend hours stalking insects, mice, and even shadows, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost predatory. When he caught something, he didn't play with it like most puppies would. He dispatched it quickly and efficiently. The most puzzling behavior was his reaction to the farm animals. My chickens, who were usually friendly and curious about new additions to the farm, gave Scout a wide berth. They'd cluck nervously and hurry away whenever he appeared, even though he showed no aggression toward them. But it was the horses that really concerned me. Thunder and Lightning, my two quarter horses who had never been afraid of anything, became visibly agitated whenever Scout was around. They'd snort, stamp their feet, and retreat to the far side of their paddock. I'd never seen them react that way to any dog before. Scout seemed to sense their fear and would often sit at the fence line, perfectly still, just watching them. There was something in his posture during these moments that made me uncomfortable. A tension, an alertness that seemed too intense for a young dog. I tried introducing him to the horses gradually, keeping him on a leash and speaking in soothing tones, but their reaction only got worse. Thunder actually reared up one day when Scout got too close, something he'd never done in all the years I'd owned him. I began to wonder if Scout might have some wild dog in his bloodline, something that triggered the horse's instinctual fear of predators. It was on a clear March night, about 6 weeks after I'd found Scout, that I heard it for the first time. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when a sound drifted through my open window that made my blood run cold. It was a howl, long and mournful, unlike anything I'd ever heard from a domestic dog. I sat up in bed listening intently. The sound came again, and this time I was certain it was coming from somewhere near the house. My first thought was that there might be wolves in the area, though they'd been extinct in this part of Montana for decades. I grabbed a flashlight and my rifle, then stepped out onto the porch. The night was perfectly still, with a full moon casting everything in silver light. I called out softly for Scout, expecting him to come running from wherever he'd been exploring. Instead, I found him sitting in the middle of the yard, his head tilted back toward the moon. As I watched in amazement, he let out another howl, this one even longer and more haunting than the first. The sound seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, resonating across the empty fields. "Scout," I called softly, and he turned to look at me. In the moonlight, his eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire. He trotted over to me, tail wagging, as if nothing unusual had happened. I knelt down and scratched behind his ears, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. The howl had been so wild, so primal, that it sent shivers down my spine. It was the sound of something that belonged in the wilderness, not on a domestic farm. That night, I lay awake wondering what kind of animal I'd really rescued from the snow. By late spring, Scout had grown considerably. What had been a tiny puppy was now a sleek, powerful animal that stood nearly 2 feet at the shoulder. His coat had thickened and darkened, and his features had become more angular, more defined. The local wildlife seemed to sense something different about him, too. The usual rabbits and squirrels that frequented the property had all but disappeared. Even the coyotes that used to yip and howl in the distance had gone silent. It was as if every wild animal in the area had decided to give our farm a wide berth. I started doing research online, comparing Scout's appearance and behavior to various dog breeds. The more I read, the more uncomfortable I became. His proportions were wrong for a domestic dog. His legs were too long, his snout too narrow, his ears too pointed. And those eyes, still that piercing blue, seemed to hold an intelligence that was almost unsettling. One evening, while Scout was sleeping by the fire, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. His paws were enormous, far larger than they should have been for his body size. I'd read that wolves had disproportionately large paws to help them navigate through snow, and Scout's were exactly like the pictures I'd seen. I called Dr. Henderson the next day and asked him to come out for another examination. When he arrived, Scout was nowhere to be found, despite my calling for him repeatedly. It was as if he sensed what was happening and had deliberately made himself scarce. "That's unusual," Dr. Henderson commented. "Most dogs are eager to greet visitors." We spent an hour searching the property, but Scout had vanished completely. It wasn't until after the vet left that he reappeared, emerging from the woods with that silent, fluid grace that was becoming his trademark. I couldn't put off the inevitable any longer. Deep down, I'd known for weeks what Scout really was, but I'd been afraid to admit it to myself. The evidence was overwhelming. The howling, the way other animals reacted to him, his physical characteristics, and most of all, his behavior. Scout wasn't a dog at all. He was a wolf. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I'd been sharing my home with a wild predator, treating him like a pet, allowing him to roam freely around my livestock. The fact that he hadn't heard anything yet was probably just due to his young age, and the fact that I'd been feeding him well. I spent hours researching wolf behavior, trying to understand what I was dealing with. Everything I read confirmed my fears. Wolves were pack animals, highly intelligent, and potentially dangerous to humans and livestock. Even hand-raised wolves retained their wild instincts and could become unpredictable as they matured. The responsible thing to do would be to contact the wildlife authorities immediately. They would relocate Scout to a sanctuary or, more likely, euthanize him. The thought made me sick to my stomach. Despite everything, I'd grown attached to him. He'd never shown any aggression toward me, and in his own way, he seemed to trust me completely. That evening, as I watched Scout lying by the fire, I tried to reconcile the fearsome predator I'd read about with the animal that had been my constant companion for months. He looked so peaceful, so innocent, that it was hard to believe he was anything other than an unusually large dog. But when he opened his eyes and looked at me, I saw something there that I'd been trying to ignore, a wildness that no amount of domestication could ever fully tame. The next few days were the hardest of my life. I found myself constantly watching Scout, looking for signs of the predator I now knew him to be. Every interaction felt loaded with new meaning. When he played with his toys, I saw a predator practicing his hunting skills. When he followed me around the farm, I wondered if he was studying my routines. The horses' fear made perfect sense now. They could smell what he was, could sense the danger that I'd been blind to. Even the chickens, with their simple bird brains, had known better than to trust him. I called several wildlife sanctuaries trying to find a place that might take him. Most wouldn't even consider it. Hand-raised wolves, they explained, were often more dangerous than wild ones because they'd lost their natural fear of humans. The few facilities that might have been able to help had waiting lists years long. The local wildlife department was more direct. "If you've been harboring a wolf illegally, sir, our only option would be to euthanize the animal immediately. Wolves haven't been seen in this area for over 50 years, and we can't risk having one established territory here." I hung up the phone feeling sick. Scout had done nothing wrong. He was just following his nature, the same nature that had allowed him to survive being abandoned in a snowstorm as a tiny pup. It wasn't his fault that I'd mistaken him for something he wasn't. That night, I sat on the porch with Scout beside me, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. He seemed to sense my distress and pressed closer to me, offering what comfort he could. I realized then that I couldn't make this decision based on fear or what others expected me to do. I had to do what was right for Scout. As I wrestled with my decision, fate intervened in an unexpected way. I was in town picking up supplies when I overheard a conversation at the feed store that changed everything. Two men were discussing a wildlife rehabilitation center that had recently opened about 3 hours north of us, specifically designed to care for wolves and other large predators. I approached them and learned that the center was run by a woman named Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a wildlife biologist who specialized in wolf behavior. They took in wolves that couldn't be released into the wild for various reasons: injuries, human imprinting, or illegal captivity situations like mine. I drove home with a spark of hope for the first time in days. That evening, I called the center and spoke with Dr. Mitchell herself. I explained Scout's situation honestly, expecting judgment or anger. Instead, I found understanding and compassion. "You're not the first person to mistake a wolf pup for a dog," she said gently. "It happens more often than you'd think, especially with very young animals. The important thing is that you're doing the right thing now." She agreed to take Scout, but warned me that the transition wouldn't be easy. "He's bonded with you," she explained. "Separating him from the only family he's known will be traumatic, but it's necessary for his long-term well-being and safety." We arranged for her to come to the farm the following week. She wanted to observe Scout in his current environment before the transfer to better understand his personality and needs. As I hung up the phone, I felt a mixture of relief and heartbreak. I was doing the right thing for Scout, but that didn't make it any easier. I had 1 week left with the animal that had become such an important part of my life. The week that followed was bittersweet. I found myself treasuring every moment with Scout, knowing our time together was coming to an end. I took him on long walks through the property, letting him explore and run free in ways I'd been too nervous to allow before. Scout seemed to sense that something was changing. He became more clingy than usual, rarely leaving my side. At night, instead of sleeping in his bed by the fire, he would lie down right next to my bedroom door, as if standing guard. I started documenting everything about him: his favorite spots on the property, his routines, the foods he preferred. I wanted Dr. Mitchell to have as much information as possible to help with his transition. I even took videos of him playing and exploring, hoping that someday I might be able to visit him at the sanctuary. The horses remained wary of him until the very end, but I noticed something interesting during those final days. While they still kept their distance, they no longer seemed terrified. It was as if they could sense that Scout would be leaving soon and were no longer quite so threatened by his presence. On the night before Dr. Mitchell was scheduled to arrive, Scout and I sat together on the porch one last time. The spring air was warm and filled with the sounds of returning wildlife: frogs singing in the pond, night birds calling from the trees, the distant rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Scout lifted his head and let out one final howl, long and mournful, echoing across the valley. It was a sound of longing, of wildness calling to wildness. As I listened to it fade into the night, I knew with absolute certainty that I was making the right choice. Dr. Mitchell arrived early the next morning, driving a specially equipped van designed for transporting large predators. She was a small, energetic woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gentle hands. I could tell immediately that she genuinely cared about the animals in her charge. Scout was initially wary of her, staying close to my side and watching her every movement. But Dr. Mitchell was patient, allowing him to approach her on his own terms. She spoke to him in low, soothing tones and offered him treats from her pocket. "He's beautiful," she said, running her hands over his thick coat, "and remarkably well socialized for a hand-raised wolf. You've done an excellent job caring for him." Her words should have made me feel better, but they only intensified the ache in my chest. I'd grown to love this animal, and now I had to let him go. The actual transfer was surprisingly smooth. Dr. Mitchell had brought a large, comfortable crate that she placed in the back of her van. Scout sniffed it cautiously, then looked back at me as if asking for permission. "It's okay, boy," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "Go on." He walked into the crate without resistance, then turned around and lay down, his blue eyes fixed on me through the bars. Dr. Mitchell secured the door and gave me a moment to say goodbye. I knelt down beside the crate and reached through the bars to scratch behind his ears one last time. "Be good, Scout," I said. "I'll miss you." As the van pulled away, Scout let out a single, soft whine, the first sound of distress I'd ever heard him make. I stood in my driveway long after the van had disappeared, feeling like a piece of my heart had gone with it. The farm felt empty without Scout. I'd grown so accustomed to his constant presence that his absence was like a physical ache. Every morning I'd automatically look for him by the fire, and every evening I'd catch myself calling his name before remembering he was gone. The horses noticed the change immediately. Within days of Scout's departure, they were back to their normal, relaxed selves. They grazed peacefully in the paddock and no longer shied away from the fence line where Scout used to sit and watch them. The local wildlife began returning as well. Rabbits appeared in the garden, squirrels chattered in the trees, and I even spotted a family of foxes playing in the far field one evening. It was as if the entire ecosystem had been holding its breath while Scout was here and could finally exhale. Dr. Mitchell called me a week after the transfer to give me an update. Scout was adjusting well to the sanctuary, she reported. He'd been introduced to 2 other wolves, an older female named Luna and a younger male called River, and was beginning to form pack bonds with them. "He's still grieving the separation from you," she admitted. "But wolves are remarkably resilient. He's young enough to adapt, and having other wolves around will help him remember his true nature." She sent me photos via email, Scout running with his new packmates, playing in a large, naturalistic enclosure, and sleeping in a pile with Luna and River. In the pictures, he looked healthy and content, though I couldn't help but notice that his eyes seemed different somehow, wilder and more distant. I was happy for him, truly I was, but that didn't make missing him any easier. 3 months after Scout left, I was working in the barn when I heard thunder and lightning whinnying nervously in their paddock. I looked up to see them bunched together at the far end of their enclosure, staring intently at something near the tree line. My heart skipped a beat as a familiar gray shape emerged from the woods. Scout stood at the edge of the clearing, larger and more muscular than when I'd last seen him, his coat thick and glossy. He looked magnificent. Every inch the wild predator he was meant to be. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other across the distance. I could see the recognition in his blue eyes. But there was something else there, too. A wildness that hadn't been there before. This wasn't the same animal that had slept by my fire and followed me around the farm. This was a wolf who had remembered what he truly was. I took a step toward him, and he tensed, ready to flee. "Scout?" I called softly. His ears pricked forward at the sound of his name, and for just an instant I saw a flicker of the young animal I'd raised. But then he backed away, melting into the shadows of the forest as silently as he'd appeared. I called Dr. Mitchell immediately. "Don't worry," she assured me. "This is actually quite common. Wolves have excellent homing instincts, and he's probably just checking on his old territory. The fact that he didn't approach you directly shows that his wild instincts are properly developed now." She was right, of course. Scout's visit wasn't a sign that he wanted to come home. It was proof that he'd successfully transitioned back to his true nature. He was wild now, as he should be. Over the following months, I caught glimpses of Scout several more times. He seemed to have established a territory that included the woods around my farm, though he never came as close to the house as he had that first time. Sometimes I'd find his tracks in the mud near the creek, or catch sight of a gray shadow moving through the trees at dusk. Dr. Mitchell told me that he'd become the alpha of his small pack at the sanctuary, displaying natural leadership qualities that had surprised even her experienced staff. Eventually, they'd been able to release him and his packmates into a protected wilderness area, where they could live as truly wild wolves. The knowledge that Scout was out there, living the life he was meant to live, brought me a deep sense of satisfaction. I'd made the right choice, even though it had been one of the hardest decisions of my life. One evening in late fall, almost exactly a year after I'd first found him, I was sitting on my porch when I heard it, a long, haunting howl echoing across the valley. It was answered by another, and then another, until the night was filled with the wild music of wolves singing to the moon. I smiled, recognizing Scout's voice among the chorus. He was out there with his pack, free and wild, and exactly where he belonged. The scared, half-frozen pup I'd found in the snow had grown into the magnificent predator he was always meant to be. As I listened to their song, I felt a profound sense of completion. Sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. Thank you so much for listening to my story about Scout and the incredible journey we shared together. It taught me that sometimes the most meaningful relationships are the ones that transform us both, even when they can't last forever. I'd love to hear from you. Please write in the comments below and let me know what part of the world you're listening from. It always amazes me how these stories can reach people everywhere. And if you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to the channel for more true stories from my life on the farm. Until next time, take care of yourselves and the wild creatures that share our world.